Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are speaking with Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor is a creative activist and journalist. Her work has appeared on Free Speech TV, where she produced and hosted the radical news program Act Out for 5 years. Her print work has appeared in Mint Press News, Roar, Popular Resistance, RT, and more. She is the host of the podcast Act Out and the co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Her first long-form, deep-dive video piece, Hard Road of Hope, covers past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as West Virginia. Besides touring, performing, and media work, she assists in frontline action organizing and activist trainings. And then we'll plug your websites in the end. How you doing, Eleanor?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing all right. We're staying active and busy. We've got a protest tonight, actually, at City Hall because the Redevelopment Commission is trying to give away a $250,000 plot of land to the Fraternal Order of Police to build a cop bar. On the heels of the largest protest that we've ever had in Michigan City and in light of everything that's going on around the country.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, we got a giant mural. Well, I wouldn't call it a mural. We got a giant slogan painted on the street in front of the White House as some sort of an attempt to appease people into thinking that if you scribble Black Lives Matter on a street, it means it's actually true.
I'm glad you brought that up because I've been seeing that passed around. You're in D.C. Give us a sense of what's happening there and also give us a sense of kind of the political context, because a lot of these so-called leaders are being sort of, brought to the forefront as these wonderful woke people who are against Donald Trump. Give us a little insight into what the reality is there, if you would, please.
Yeah. So Black Lives Matter DC has long stood against DC's Mayor Bowser, who has pedestaled people like Police Chief Newsham, who is a big proponent of police brutality, and Bowser has protected him and protected brutal cops. It's not uncommon if you go to Black and brown communities in DC to see white cops policing that neighborhood wearing white supremacist paraphernalia on their shirts and things like that. They are legitimately an occupying force east of the river here in DC. And DC is kind of an interesting connection between federal and local politics. So, of course, the protests in DC that have happened in the past week or so are both on a local scale to address these issues, but also on a federal scale because they're happening outside the White House. Folks were pepper sprayed or tear gassed and then hit with rubber bullets right outside of Lafayette Square, which is right in front of the White House, just so Trump could go hold a book in front of a church. And what we've seen, members of Congress kneeling in the Emancipation Hall, wearing kente scarves, as if that somehow means that their choices to pass white supremacist legislation, not just domestically, but of course in terms of foreign wars, as if that undoes that or somehow makes it okay just because they took a knee. I couldn't help myself. I tweeted out when I saw that the next act would be Nancy Pelosi in blackface performing scenes from The Color Purple.
God. It's so true.
It's just this performative, solidarity that doesn't actually mean anything because these folks are in charge of, they could easily pass legislation, both in terms of Mayor Bowser's office on the local level and of course on the federal level, to address police brutality, to address white supremacy. And instead folks are focused on making Antifa a terrorist organization as if that were even something that you could possibly put your finger on. But so it's an interesting collection of these, the meeting of federal and local politics here in DC. But the painting of Black Lives Matter on 16th Street, which is the street that leads up to the White House, renaming it Black Lives Matter Plaza, was just a really shallow attempt. And for folks that have been organizing in this city, even not that long, like myself, a few years, it really just didn't ring true based on anything that Mayor Bowser has done locally. And actually some local activists fixed the mural or the signage and added equals defund the police.
Right on.
You can now also see from an aerial view. So local activists and artists made it clear what actually Black Lives Matter means in terms of a policy point.
That was going to be my next question. What is the reaction on behalf of the activists on the ground? I mean, everywhere that I've spoken to people, it's a lot different, depending geographically where they're located. How would I put this? How much of the action that you're seeing in the streets is like highly coordinated from the top down, and how much of this is like taking place truly from the grassroots, people who are rising up and so forth? Because I've seen a little bit of both depending on where I've been.
I'd say it's both here as well. You have local organizations led by BIPOC that are very coordinated and asking people to do specific things. And then you have people that are, just saying things like, vote him out in November and everything will be lovely.
Right.
And again, so and I think it was last week, all of my days are kind of blending together. But it was a while back that there were something like 10,000 people on 16th Street headed towards the White House. And I saw a lot of different signs. I saw a lot of folks carrying signs saying, Trump is the problem. Other people saying that, other signs saying that, Trump is the most recent manifestation. The problem is capitalism. There was a lot of tagging going on that said, capitalism and racism are the problem. Capitalism is murder. So there's a lot of recognition of the deeper issues here. But I think that unfortunately, whenever you see like tens of thousands of people in the street, a good handful of them are going to be like, oh, I came because I voted for Hillary. And I really think that everything's fine if we could just get Trump out of office. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of connecting the dots with folks who think that they should be showing up in the streets for something like this, and recognizing that this is not an electoral politics issue. This is based on the very foundation of this country, on genocide and the enslavement of human beings. So I think it's a mixed bag, so to speak. But I think that the conversations are being had, and local organizers, myself included, are figuring out ways to continue the conversation once the protests will eventually peter out, because people will look at these sort of shallow performative theatrics as a reason to step back and say, hey, we won something. So organizers are definitely thinking of ways to continue these conversations and continue the organizing, really targeting the defunding of the police and the reinvestment in communities. Do
you think the defunding of the police and reinvestment in communities is sort of the logical next step for the movement?
I do. I definitely think that that's what Black and Brown grassroots organizers have been pushing for here. And actually, DC did pass the NEAR Act, which is an act that is supposed to really put money into communities as opposed to spending it on the occupying force that are police. But it doesn't go far enough, and police again are still considered to be occupying forces in Black and Brown communities. But I think that we can't talk about police reform. How do you reform something that is literally descended from the slave patrols? That's where modern United States police come from. So I think that the idea of reforming it is kind of like saying we're going to put a Band-Aid on cancer. It's just not enough. So the legitimate next step, in my mind, in the minds of local Black and Brown organizers here, is to defund the police.
Two things I particularly like about that demand, and we've been hearing it, of course, locally. Most of the people, I think, who are grassroots activists, that's what they want to do. I like it for several reasons. I mean, one, I think there's also a nice transition after that straight to why not defund the military as well. I mean, I think the connections are clear where they're getting their training, where they're getting their, and then we're hearing people locally also talk about this, like, well, if this is how people view the police domestically, my God, how do people abroad view the U.S. military? But beyond that, I mean, I also think it's very strategic, because I have some friends on the left who are like, man, we really need to make this about capitalism explicitly. But the point I was making to them about the defund the police, and if you could transition that to also doing something around defunding the military, is you're really taking away the fangs of capitalism. I mean, if you take away the state's ability to enforce their sort of power, both from the military and the police. I mean, any actions we take then after against the 1%, against banks, against capitalists, good luck trying to put down those protests. That's the way that I see it.
Yeah, and it's a great point, because the police are literally there to serve and protect the capitalist corporate state. And so, I too have had this conversation, and I think it's an important conversation to have, about the foundations of capitalism. But I think that it's important to talk about how we get there, because we're not going to be able to wake up one day and be like, well, we beat capitalism. That's nice. There has to, and I think it's so important to like dream of the world you want to build, right? But if you don't talk about how are we going to build this house, then you'll always just be sitting there looking at a pile of bricks. So I think it's a great point, and I think that also those connections between the police and the military, not least through things like the 1033 program, but also the fact that a lot of cops are veterans, and that a lot of, like things like the exchange program that we have between the IDF and our local police departments. Right. I mean, the examples of the blurred lines between military and police are manifold.
Yep. Now, I want to move on, because last night I watched what was a phenomenal documentary, but it was also, it kept me up for probably an hour or two later than I wanted to stay up last night, because I was just sitting there thinking, I live in Michigan City, Indiana. It's a industrialized colony, but largely around steel. And then the deindustrialized process has just ravaged this area. I mean, the entire stretch from South Bend heading west to Chicago is just devastated. A lot of what you wrote about resonates on a very deep level, because we see this pain daily here in our city and in the region. The name of the documentary is Hard Road of Hope. Can you talk to me a little bit about why you decided to make this documentary, and then we'll sort of get into what's contained within it?
Sure. Well, the idea spawned from, I grew up mostly in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, and West Virginia was always like the butt end of jokes. And if you're the butt end of jokes in North Carolina, something has gone very awry. And I just always kind of grew up thinking that West Virginia was just that. It's a throwaway state filled with throwaway people. Who cares? And so when the idea came to go there and research coal, which people don't really talk about that much anymore, they think about it like it's something that from the past. But also the rise of fracking in the state, I thought that this would be a really good time to address my bigotry against the state that I had until then never visited. And what I found was that West Virginia is basically a microcosm of the United States. And your comment about Indiana is, or where you're at in Indiana, is something that I've heard from folks from California, from Louisiana, from Pennsylvania. This is the American story in so many ways. I mean, West Virginia was founded as a resource colony. It is built on the backs of people who have been oppressed and abused by corporations, by industry. And if we're going to talk about West Virginia as a throwaway state because it's been destroyed, and its people as throwaway people because they're isolated and abused and addicted to opioids, well, then where in the United States can you not throw away? Right. And the other side of that, of course, is this radical history that's been whitewashed and buried and amputated from the people there, and how important it is to recognize not just the history of West Virginia, but the radical roots of so many communities in the U.S. and beyond. So that's really why I felt the need to make this into a longer form piece and not just have it be like a passing comment on my show.
One of the things I found really interesting was that I knew a little bit of the history about the Northern industrialists, the coming for the coal and the timber. 1863, West Virginia becomes a state, and then the role. I mean, I did not know the role of Lincoln in the Civil War in West Virginia. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then also we can get into the immigrants that were brought in to then mine this coal after the war?
Sure. So in the documentary, one of the guys that I spoke to points out that there are a lot of like beautiful stories about how West Virginia became a state, and it's kind of a parallel that we could talk about is how we talk about Thanksgiving, and the Native Americans were just so happy that right. Settlers were here and here have some corn. And so people talk about West Virginia as it wanted to basically secede from Virginia because they didn't want slaves. That's just not true. Basically what happened is that Lincoln understood that in order to keep the supply lines open, he needed trains. He needed train tracks, and those train tracks belonged to industry. And so he went to the industrialists and said, "Look, if you help me keep the supply lines open for coal and timber to fuel the Union Army, I will literally just give you a state, and that state will be West Virginia." And so that's how West Virginia came to be in 1863. It had nothing to do with slavery. There were plenty of slave owners. There were plenty of people that wanted to continue to have slaves. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the profit margins and the ability to literally fuel the war.
I hate to bring up two older white men, but your work in this documentary reminds me of both sort of a combination of Howard Zinn's work, but also Chris Hedges' work. I mean, Hedges I appreciate because he focuses on regions in the United States, as we're talking about, that are all too often forgotten, but what are in reality sort of is the reality of the United States. And then also Howard Zinn's work, because the two people that you interview the most, there's an older, I should have written their names down, but there's an older gentleman with glasses who really tells this history. And there's an older white woman who sort of also is talking about this history. She runs, I think, the museum or the history museum down there. Can you talk about both of those people and then this importance of like remembering the history? I mean, particularly here, I'm thinking about the immigrant workers that they brought in, tried to divide them, but then retelling that story is like, but they found a way under all of these terrible circumstances to still band together collectively to build that solidarity and organize and fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. So the folks that you mentioned are one of the guy's name is Paul Corbett Brown, and he's the president of Keepers of the Mountain, which is an anti mountaintop removal organization. And then Wilma Steele, who is one of the board members of the Mine Wars Museum in Matewan, West Virginia. And people might recognize the name Matewan. There was a film called Matewan about the Matewan Massacre and about the mine wars that happened in southern West Virginia and Kentucky. And basically what happened is that, and we recognize these tactics when you hear me talk about them and when you hear about them in the film, what happened is that folks coming on boats from Ellis Island, coal industrialists would go up and meet these people as they got off the boats and bring them down to coal country and basically say, like, here's your American dream, to work in the mine for not American money. They got paid in basically coal company money that they could then use at the company store. Folks might remember like the song, "I sold my soul to the company store." That's what he's talking about in that song, because they didn't get paid with actual money. So they were basically like indentured servants to the coal companies. And they put these different immigrants on different parts of the coal mine. So for instance, like African Americans that were coming from deep south, they put those people on one part of the coal mine. And then they told the Jewish immigrants, those people are savages. And then they told the other immigrants that Jewish immigrants eat babies. And all of this, these familiar tactics like hate the people, hate your fellow workers, be afraid of them. And basically what happened is through a lot of hard work and organizing, people realized, oh wait, they're not actually horrible human beings, and yet we have so much in common. We might not speak the same language, but we can get across that we understand what oppression feels like. We understand who the enemy is, and it's not each other. And so what happened is that folks band together, white folks marching next to black folks, basically went on strike and marched against the coal industry and shot at coal industrialists and won some basic workers' rights that we still appreciate today. And the idea, and this happened in the early 20th century. And when you hear this story, wait, there were black folks that were marching next to white folks, and they shot at coal mine owners, and then the coal mine owners said, okay, we'll give you some basic workers' rights. It sounds absurd, but that is the history of West Virginia. And that's in fact where the term redneck comes from. The term redneck comes from these folks that would tie red bandanas around their necks to identify each other. So they took on the term redneck as a source of pride. And what that term meant was that you were fighting for workers' rights. You were fighting for equal rights for blacks and whites. And so this idea of the redneck now being some sort of uneducated, racist, hillbilly is a complete 180 from where it originated. And so that really speaks to the power of propaganda and the power of burying the past, and why it's so important to uncover that past and teach it to folks, that because this is not a history that's taught in West Virginia, much less anywhere else in the United States.
And people who don't live in these areas, it's the same here with the steel mills. At one point, there was 130,000 union steel mill jobs stretching from South Bend to Chicago. The year that I was born in 1984, now there's 22,000. So there's been 110, 115,000 of those jobs that have been lost. And still yet, even after being shit on by these industries, it's tough because what's the only good paying job in Northwest Indiana? You got to be a member of the USW and you have to work in the steel mills. Otherwise, you're working at a restaurant, a car wash, a gas station, or something that you can't even, you can't make ends meet. Can you talk a little bit about this, how the difficulty on the one end of, remembering this history, building that solidarity, but also then coming up with alternatives to the existing structure? You mentioned, of course, this transition from coal to now natural gas being sold is like, this is the thing that will save everyone. We've had the same here, somewhat with natural gas. We have the connection to the city in which I live is that we have a coal-fired power plant that sits on the south shore of Lake Michigan, in a predominantly black neighborhood on the west side of Michigan City. So at the same time, people look at the coal-fired power plant, much like the steel mills, and are like, look, that's one of the last remaining good jobs around here. Can you talk about that struggle, and then maybe also how this plays a role with this sort of introduction of natural gas now as some kind of a savior for people?
Absolutely. And when you were talking, I was reminded of some of the work that I did down in Louisiana when we were fighting the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which is the tail end of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And those lands down there in southern Louisiana are the ancestral lands of the Attakapas-Ishak people. And officially speaking, the Attakapas-Ishak Nation does not have a stance on oil. Unofficially, several of the members of that nation that I spoke to said, yeah, of course we hate it. It's horrific. But we can't have an official stance because otherwise we wouldn't be able to survive. And this is the situation for so many people. And it's why it's so important. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the film too is that as organizers, we can't wander into these communities and say, you're an awful human being for working in coal or working in oil. If any one of us was faced with a choice, watch your family starve or work in a coal mine, I think every one of us would be putting on a hard hat and saying, where should I go?
That's right.
This is not a choice. And this is why it's so important to recognize who the culprit is here. And also recognize that the culprit changes. The tactics don't change, but the name of the culprit changes. So, for instance, what you're seeing in West Virginia, coal is dying, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Obama tried to save it, Trump's trying to save it, but you can't because there's just not enough coal left. A former coal miner that I spoke to said it's like, the last of the peanut butter in the jar, and you're just trying to scrape the last of it out. Right. But once it's gone, it's just gone. Which is, of course, what mountaintop removal is. It, like fracking, is trying to get the last coal seams in the mountain, as opposed to doing the traditional mining where you just dug back into the mountain and just picked up a bunch of coal. That coal's all gone. So what we see now is fracking is trying to take over what the coal industry has left. And so it's using the same tactics. It's using the same tactics of oppression, of propaganda, saying that, if you want electricity, you have to support fracking. If you want jobs, you have to support fracking. When, of course, the reality is you could give people jobs doing anything. You could give people jobs, planting trees or just walking back and forth on a street for no reason. You could give people jobs doing anything. But the reality of the situation is the willpower is only there. And one of the people in the film says this, the willpower is only there for jobs when it has to do with destroying somebody's home place, destroying the water, destroying the air. And so we're seeing the same thing with fracking that we've seen that we saw with coal. And that's, again, that's West Virginia is a microcosm. Around the country, folks are shifting from coal to fracking, or looking at fracking as a bridge fuel, which is the same argument that they made with coal. Oh, it's clean coal, whatever. I mean, as if that were something that were possible. So it's really that same shift in tactics. And meanwhile, you have folks that are, instead of trying to just look at coal miners and say you're awful, trying to retrain them, for instance, for renewables, trying to retrain them in regenerative farming, things like that, and trying to shift it so that there's not a huge loss of income at the same time, which is really difficult because, of course, with the subsidies that we have in this country, all of the subsidies go to fossil fuels. None of them go to renewables. They certainly don't go to things like regenerative farming. But folks are really trying in West Virginia, which again it's the second most rural state in the nation. So the idea that there are lots of options for people in other industries is just it's non-existent, because there aren't other industries there. If you've ever been there, it's just a lot of rolling hills, and it's some like these small communities, but there aren't a lot of other options for people. So folks are really trying to push this idea that, no, we're not just trying to take your job or take your identity because people really feel culturally tied to coal. We're just trying to shift this to a different industry that will actually be good for you and for your community. And so there's a lot of deep organizing there. And again, a lot of that goes back to connecting people with their radical past, and trying to remove people from this feeling that they are identifying with the coal industry. I feel that I am part of coal, and really trying to remove that narrative.
Something else that really struck home with me was the devastating impact this has had on communities and human beings in our region as well, a region that's highly segregated racially and ethnically, but also people who are dealing with devastating poverty that then sort of explodes into devastating forms of drug addiction. The war on drugs has had a horrific impact on our community. Too many of our Black and brown brothers and sisters have been sent to jail. We have opioid addictions that are through the roof. The reason I want you to talk about this is not, I think there's a level of like poverty porn that goes on today and through some media outlets. That's not what I got from your documentary, and that's not why I'm bringing this up. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up is because so many people here blame themselves. So there's so many people who are going to watch this video, or hopefully so many people who watch this video, especially local, regional people, who I've seen over the years blame themselves for what are systemic failures, institutional failures, and then that self-blame manifests in the form of violence, addiction, and so forth. I want you to talk a little bit about what this also looks like in West Virginia, just so people can understand that this isn't just particular to one specific region or industry or part of the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, West Virginia holds the uncoveted first place for highest opioid deaths in the nation. But as you note, that's not a West Virginia problem. It's a national problem. What made West Virginia such a perfect place for that is that it's at the intersection of extreme isolation and extreme oppression due to the industries. So folks, as I mentioned, it's the second most rural state in the nation. There are 1.8 million people there, less than the borough of Brooklyn in New York City. So folks were already pretty isolated geographically speaking, but then there's the sort of the isolation that comes from being used and cast aside by industry. And as you noted, when you were born compared to now, the amount of jobs in a specific industry like steel or coal has just plummeted. And folks aren't told, hey, like you noted, this isn't your fault. This is industry just falling apart. They're told the typical American thing, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you don't have boots and straps, that's also your fault. So there's extreme isolation. And if we look at other, triggers for addiction, it's trauma, it's stress. So the idea, and this is not just physical trauma, but mental trauma, of course, but, working in these industries is incredibly physically taxing. Cases of black lung have resurged in Appalachia and Southern Appalachia recently because of the fine silica dust. that is part of the newer mountaintop removal mining, as opposed to the old type of mining. So there's physical, emotional, mental pain. There's extreme isolation geographically, but also, again, physically, emotionally and mentally. So these are main drivers for addiction. And of course, with regards to the opioid crisis, this isn't something that folks were ever warned about. The Sackler family made billions of dollars by telling people this isn't addictive at all. You'll be fine. And in West Virginia, in particular, if you don't work, then you are destitute, and you are risking starvation and homelessness. So they'd say, here, take this little pill, you'll feel better, stop complaining, get back to work. And so I think, what made West Virginia unique was that it was at those crossroads of all of these issues of isolation, stress, and trauma. But yeah, again, it's one of those microcosm issues, and it's an issue that you mentioned the war on drugs. This idea that addiction is somehow someone's fault, as opposed to a public health crisis that has very, very distinct public health foundations, as opposed to someone's just defective. And so they started taking opioids, which is, of course, the story that gets peddled to addicts and their families. So I think one of the things that's really powerful about organizing in these spaces is also to let people know that this industry that you've been told your whole life is part of your identity. The proud American coal miner who's got so much soot on his face you can't even see him, with his little hatchet and everything, ready to go to work. That doesn't have to be you. And this broken person that has been broken by the industry can actually get help, because it's a public health issue. It's not because you're defective. And so that's very much part of the organizing as well. And speaking to the pain that people are feeling, which is also, something that with regards to this typical Americana image, it's mostly men that work in coal mines, and this idea that you couldn't possibly share your pain, whether that be physical or certainly not emotional, and so people turn inwards, and they turn to drugs to find an outlet for that pain.
God, this reminds me so much of the steel mills up here. It's really uncanny. I mean, I was just going to ask you, as you were saying it, how much of a role does sort of this hypermasculinity play within this process of internal sort of subjective but also social devastation, because we see it locally. It reminds me a lot of the military. All of us coming out extremely broken individuals, many of us incapable of identifying that because for any number of reasons, but a lot of it having to do with that sense of like, I'm a tough man and that's not what men do. And so even the folks who who are still working in the steel mills, who are still making good money, they come home from work, they hate life, they're pissed off, they got to go back, they're drinking every night, they're doing drugs, whatever it is. Can you also talk a little, because even on a deeper level, there seems to be a sort of strain within the documentary about alienation from ecology, alienation from the living world, and what that does to us, not just with relation to the industry, but us ourselves as human beings, living on this living planet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
This conversation wasn't in the documentary, but I remember having a conversation with one of the guys in the documentary, and he said that when he was talking about one of the issues with mountaintop removal, and he was talking about it like, it's like decapitating a person, because the tops of these mountains are like the heads of these mountains, and it's the source of the headwaters. It's such a beautiful place of biodiversity. And then someone just called out in the middle of his commentaries, like, that sounds gay. And I was like, wow, I thought we had passed that. Right. But no, I mean, this is just, even to talk about the personification of these mountains is somehow gay. Whatever that means. But of course, it's about the idea that if you talk about nature as if it's a living thing, which obviously scientifically speaking it is, but if you talk about our place in nature, it can easily be looked down upon, like again, that's kind of un-American, right? Because we use nature. We're not a part of nature. Nature Right. is there to be under our boot, literally and figuratively. So I think that that sort of connection with nature is a really important shift. And one of the things that towards the end of the documentary that that I cover is one of the guys that's been doing a lot of work on mountaintop removal, against mountaintop removal. Talks about the importance of really being connected to nature, not just having it like going to a national park and like taking pictures of Joshua trees, but like actually being a part of the earth and reconnecting with it via farming and conscious hunting, not just going out to shoot things because you like shooting things, but actually understanding the ecosystems that you're a part of. Eating as part of that ecosystem, so you're not having mangoes if you're in Alaska or something. But recognizing those connections. And of course, a deep part of that is recognizing and acknowledging indigenous history in these lands. And that's another thing that I put at the end of the documentary. A journalist friend of mine, Jen Deerenwater, who is Cherokee, those are her ancestral lands, part of southern West Virginia. And she talks about how she feels a deep connection there, but also a deep pain understanding what has been done to the land, because she feels a connection to that land. And I can personally speak to that as somebody who's Swedish and grew up there partially. I feel a deep connection to that land. I am very much a stranger in these lands. This is way too hot for me in DC, but I feel a deep connection to my home place in Sweden. And so I understand that connection, and I also understand the importance of building that connection in actual ways, like just like painting Black Lives Matter on a street doesn't mean that it's true. Just talking about nature, like, oh, isn't it nice? Pictures of George Bush on his ranch in Texas being like, I love my ranch. That doesn't mean that you're not responsible for destroying nature. So I think it's really important to have those conversations and recognize that the indigenous perspective on nature is not something of the past. Again, it's how we have to look at the current situation and the future if we're going to have a future, because we are not separate from nature. We are part of it, and we depend upon it way more than nature depends on us. The earth will shrug us off like an annoying tick once we kill ourselves. But I would like to get to the point where we're not actually actively killing ourselves. So that way of looking at things is super important. And particularly in a place like West Virginia, it's so clear, because as such a rural state, you're constantly bombarded with these beautiful vistas of these rolling hills, and Appalachia is considered to be one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. And so there's so much beauty there. There's so much natural beauty, and to not just to appreciate, but actually literally to help bolster through things like regenerative farming and connecting people to that land in a meaningful way, as opposed to an exploitative way vis-a-vis mining or fracking.
How do you think? Because I know we're running out of time. How do you think we can connect movements like what are happening around the country right now with also what's happening in a place like West Virginia, Northwest Indiana? I mean, we have some of that movement right now, but what are your thoughts on, I'm sure you're thinking about this constantly, like what are your thoughts on bringing these movements together? People living in rural areas, people living in urban areas, people who are coming from predominantly white backgrounds, people who are living in very diverse metropolitan regions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. We can't work in single issues because we don't live single issue lives, right? And I think that it's important, just like in the film, I make this commentary that like we all live under the same system. We're coming at it from different places. So no, I have no idea what it means to be a Black man in the U.S. I have no idea what it means to be an Indigenous woman or Two-Spirit. But that I don't need to. I just need to understand that as a white woman, a white queer woman living in the United States, that I have a role to play, and I have one of my roles as an organizer is to connect these issues and to connect these people, so that we recognize that all of these voices are necessary. That the people can step back when their voices are overrepresented, and have people step forward when their voices are necessary, but that all of these issues, the death, the murder of Black folks in the streets by police is so inextricably connected to the devastation that folks are feeling and experiencing in West Virginia. because again, it's all part of this larger capitalist system that was built on genocide and the forced enslavement of human beings. These are all the continuation of this system that places profit above people, that never recognized basic human rights. And so when we talk about, for instance, defunding the police and investing in communities, well, these forgotten communities in West Virginia also need to be funded. Their schools need to be funded. There are kids walking into schools in West Virginia cleaning coal ash off of their desks. How about investing in something other than coal so that kids don't have to be huffing coal ash first thing in the morning? All of these issues are connected to the corporate state and the continued oppression underneath the boot of the corporate state, and recognizing that all of our experiences are necessarily different because we come from different backgrounds and different places, geographically speaking as well. But there's so much solidarity to be built there, to kind of like be kind of corny for a second and say that we're all on the hard road of hope, and we're all walking at different points on it. But we should all be walking together towards the same direction of progress and recognizing the points of solidarity, the intersections of solidarity that we're capable of building.
Well, goddamn, this has been the most lucid, badass interview we've done so far for the program. Sergio shaking his head in the back. Shit, no, you motivate me. I love listening to you. You're a powerful voice. I really love listening to you. I love reading your work. I love seeing what you're up to. So it's a pleasure to have you on here. And I tell people how they can access the film, tell people how they can access your work, and then any organizations you want to plug, like, hey, go support these people, follow them, whatever it is.
Sure. So the film is at hardroadofhope.com. My work outside of the film is at artkillingapathy.com. I just posted a photo essay from the streets of DC from the week of protests that have been going on. In terms of organizations, I've been doing a lot of mutual aid work here in DC. Mutual Aid Disaster Relief is a great organization that kind of has like a national perspective on mutual aid work, not just due to Corona, but also, now that hurricane season is looming, and hurricane season doesn't care one bit whether folks are suffering from COVID. So it's really important to support those folks. Also, communitybailfunds.com is a good hub for folks that are dealing with that are facing bail, the crime of being poor. So they're sitting in jail for everything from protesting to having a bag of weed on them. And so communitybailfunds.com basically is a hub that gets money out to various communities in order to get those people out.
Thank you, Eleanor. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Vince. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay in touch, and we'll be reaching out again, too. I mean, I've been trying to keep in contact with as many people from around the states as possible and around the world, but really getting a sense of, like, what are you seeing on the ground? What are you seeing that's working? What's not working? I mean, I think that's so important, and we have the ability to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I definitely want to hear about what you guys are doing and organizing there, because like I mentioned, we're trying to keep the organizing going even after the protests kind of taper a little bit.
We're in the same mindset. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, Eleanor. You've been watching Park Media. My name is Vince Emanuele, and we will see you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.